Hello, beautiful Sunday afternoon and a beautiful day. I thought I'd sit out here on my back porch and just happened to tune in and listen to one of my favorite people, Dr. Michael Brown, who just put out a video called Why I'm Not a Calvinist. And I always admire how cordial he is in his loving way of approaching his brothers with whom he disagrees. And then shortly thereafter, Dr. James White produced a video saying why he is a Calvinist. And I wanted to respond a little bit to the back and forth because I think this is a very common response of Calvinist to non-Calvinist when we say the reason we're not Calvinist, and one of the reasons Dr. Michael Brown mentioned was that when the Scripture presents God as interactive with us, for example, Genesis chapter 6, when he says that that the people were corrupt and that it grieved him that he had even made man. And the grieving and the frustration and the appealing to mankind to do things that they're not willing to do, that I would gather you like a mother hen would gather her chicks under her wings, but they were unwilling. And those kinds of questions are oftentimes expressed throughout the Scriptures of an interactive God, a God of relationship, an incarnational God, a God that reacts within time and space to us. By the way, that's my dog Summer that's going by up there. And so, anyway, I wanted to. And that's my other dog, Autumn, Summer and Autumn. We've got them. We don't have 4 seasons covered, but we got 2 of them covered. Both the schnauzers, by the way. And the question becomes, what is the difference between the two? Because Dr. James White makes an interesting point when he says, well, it's really called the U2 fallacy. It's, well, you have the same problem, Dr. Brown, because you believe in omniscience. You're not an open theist, Dr. Brown, so you believe that God knew beforehand that people would rebel. So it doesn't make any sense for you to say that God grieved over something he knew was going to happen anyway. And so the Calvinist thinks that they're getting out from underneath that argument by just simply saying, you too, you have the same problem. And this is simply not the case. It's not the same problem at all. Now, both have problems, but they're different, completely different problems. One has the problem of believing that God, in some mysterious and eternal way, knows all things. We don't know how he gains knowledge. We don't know how the eternal knowledge works. It's a divine, eternal attribute of God. We don't know in our finite minds how it works. And we've admitted as much. We've talked about this with the Boethius and his presentation of the eternal now view of God. C.S. Lewis made it more popular, where it's the belief that God knows all things, not because he's determined it, but because he is at all places at all times, as the eternal I am. And I believe that's the view that Dr. Michael Brown holds to. Don't quote me on that, but I've heard him speak of the eternal knowledge of God, and it's how mysterious it is, but at the same time, it's not necessarily determinative. In other words, he doesn't necessarily determine that which will come to pass, though he may know it. And I don't see a particular philosophical or even illogical problem with God expressing in his incarnational way, in being in time and space, about being upset with or frustrated with something he could have eternally foreknown to come to pass. In other words, I may know that, for example, when my wife and I got married, we might have known labor pains were coming. If we get engaged, we get married, we have intercourse, and we have a child. We know the pain of childbirth is inevitable. That's going to come. But yet we can choose to get married and be together. We can choose that, knowing full well where the pain is going to come in that, and still express the grief and the torment and the agony and the all the things that we go through as a couple, especially her, when it comes to feeling of that pain, especially when our first child's 11 pounds 4 ounces. Yes, it's true. Colson, big baby. Our second one was a preemie. He was only 10 pounds 3 ounces. Anyway, that's not the point. We are talking about pain and suffering, though, and so it is on topic. I just wanted to say that we can foreknow that pain is coming and still express within that time and space when it actually hits us that grief when it comes. We can know, for example, that my parents are very likely going to pass before one of us, but we can know that's coming, but yet still express the grief in the moment that it happens. And so too, it's not far-fetched for us to think that God would express grief in an event that he has foreknown would come to pass. It is, however, very strange and very difficult to swallow the concept and idea that God has in some way brought to pass by unchangeable means, has decreed for, has foreordained, caused, whatever verb the Calvinist chooses to use in this particular context, to bring to pass a thing that is supposed to bring him the most glory and pleasure. It's supposed to bring him glory. He is, in other words, he's ordained it to come to pass for his own glory, and yet he expresses grief about it coming to pass. Like, I have caused this thing to come to pass, and then when it comes to pass, I'm going to be grieved about it and tell people I'm upset with it and tell people I don't want that to happen and tell people it never crossed my mind, like he does in Jeremiah 7:31 when they were sacrificing babies and those kinds of things. According to James White's theology, God sovereignly ordained, decreed for that to come to pass, and yet externally expresses he didn't want it to come to pass. He didn't like it. He hates it. He abhors it. It's just a really difficult thing to say that God unchangeably decreed something to come to pass for his greatest glory, yet express grief and frustration and anger towards it coming to pass. That's what I believe Dr. Brown was expressing, that when you have that kind of expression from God saying he does not want something or he abhors so that something has come to pass, that it's truly something that's acting and is happening that is against his will and his desire, and that he genuinely did not want it to happen. And I think that's what Dr. Brown was expressing, and what James White was trying to do was the U2 fallacy was to say, well, Dr. Brown, you have the same problem because you believe in foreknowledge. And it's simply not the same problem. It's a different problem. I mean, I'm not saying there's not some philosophical answers and questions with regard to how God foreknows things and eternal knowledge of things and how all that works within his eternal nature. I'm not denying the tension that's there with eternal knowledge. But to pretend like it's exactly one and the same, like Dr. Brown has the same problem that Dr. White has, and that's just simply not the case. You have two very distinct problems. You have one who believes that God has sovereignly brought to pass the very evil that he's bemoaning and the very things that he is expressing frustration in. It's kind of like that Theology Unplugged podcast we played not long ago, where a bunch of good Calvinistic brothers are just talking unplugged about the different passages of Scripture and some of their troubling issues that they have with them. And one of them talks about Genesis 6, and he reads where it says that he's become frustrated with men and regrets that he ever made them, and his heart was troubled. And then one of the Calvinists says, it's kind of strange. Why didn't he just regenerate more of them? Why didn't he just elect and regenerate more of the people during the time of Noah, and thus irresistibly, through sovereign means, cause them to act the way he really wants them to act, instead of expressing trouble and expressing grief or frustration and those kinds of things about them acting the way that God has eternally predetermined for them to act. And so it just doesn't seem like near as much of a philosophical or logical problem to be grieved in time to something that comes to pass that you have permitted to allow to happen freely and that you may have in some eternal way foreknown, versus decreeing, planning, and causing it to come to pass through sovereign means, and then expressing grief and frustration and torment over it coming to pass. That's the problem I don't think is being addressed properly. So just my 2 cents worth. Have a great Sunday. Bye.